Thank you all for coming, and thank you for having me. Thank you to the Freedom Rights Project. It's delightful to be here in Copenhagen. I'm told that if the conference continues to go well, it will be commemorated by repainting the mural at the back with all of us. So I hope you're wearing something you like, because it will be forever commemorated. My name is David Keyes, and I started a human rights organization called Advancing Human Rights together with Bob Bernstein, who founded Human Rights Watch in 1978. And 4 years ago, I moved from the Middle East to New York City to join Bob in this new venture because he was greatly disappointed with the trajectory of the human rights movement broadly, including the organization that he founded. He felt that there had been a crisis in moral clarity in the human rights field, an overemphasis on open societies, often at the expense of closed societies, democracies at the expense of dictatorships. Just looking at the Middle East, in the first decade of, from 2000 to 2010, his old organization and many others had focused more attention on the Middle East's lone liberal democracy, the one state with women's rights and free speech, than it did on Iran, Syria, and Libya combined. And he thought that this was an abdication of moral responsibility and a confusion between the vast gulf between societies that, broadly speaking, respect human rights and dictatorships that don't have a fraction of those rights. He looked at issues of hate speech and state-sponsored incitement emanating from Iran, and when he approached the human rights community and asked them to criticize this clear violation of the Genocide Convention, there was great reticence and hesitation. Many said, well, we can't condemn Iran's incitement because it's not incitement at all, despite the fact that there were clear calls to annihilate a member state of the United Nations. What they termed it was advocacy and not incitement, advocacy being protected under international law, because they didn't see the link between the words and the action, despite the fact that state-sponsored incitement is always the precursor to the genocide itself. And there was clear rhetoric coming from Ayatollah Khamenei down to Ahmadinejad, down to other senior figures of the Iranian regime. Bob looked at the issue of war and peace, and he thought that the stance of the human rights community, broadly speaking, was profoundly wrong when it came to issues of neutrality. The stated position of many large human rights organizations is neutrality between parties. It doesn't matter if one of those parties incites to genocide and the other is democratic. It doesn't matter if one side is dictatorial and the other is democratic. And in wars between Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran, neutrality was the default position. Many human rights groups saying we derive our legitimacy from the fact that we condemn both democrats and dictatorships. And in our view, the legitimacy to condemn brutal dictators does not emanate from the ability to criticize democracies as well, but rather there needs to be a restoring of moral clarity, so much so that there is never a confusion between open and closed societies. And perhaps most damning, he and I both believe that there's been a lack of efficiency and a lack of understanding of the changing nature of human rights, particularly coming from closed societies. Whereas only a decade or two ago it was infinitely more difficult to get stories out from closed societies, technology has dramatically transformed dissidents' ability to get their story known. During the Soviet time, one study said that from 1950 to 1975, there were about 1,500 pieces of samizdat literature, underground literature, that was passed hand to hand, that made it out of the Soviet Union into Western countries. And that was the small window with which the West had to understand the brutality of the evil empire. While today, with Twitter, Facebook, and many other social mediums, it is not difficult to find out what is happening in Syria, in Iran, even with censorship. There are a myriad of ways to circumvent censorship. And so we created Advancing Human Rights to attempt to restore some of the moral clarity of the human rights world and to return to the universal values of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, with a particular emphasis on technology and the internet. I had started a group called Cyber Dissidents to support bloggers in the Middle East, and we joined together with a group called Movements.org, founded by Google's executive Jared Cohen. He approached us and asked us to take over his new organization, and so we reach out to dissidents in closed societies throughout the world, trying to give them platforms to strengthen and empower them. We've just built a marketplace to connect dissidents and dictatorships around the world with people throughout the West who have the resources and expertise to help them. Bott's critique was not only focused on the human rights community itself, but also on Western states who historically had engaged in far too much appeasement when it came to dictatorships. It's hard now to remember before the Arab Spring, but there was near uniformity of thought amongst the elite, the policy world, the press, and academia as to the stability and reform-mindedness of dictatorships throughout the Middle East. I'll give you a few examples. In 2009, Newsweek printed an article saying that an articulate, enlightened and charismatic leader like Bashar al-Assad was the best thing going for Syria, and that an enlightened dictator like Assad could help pull Syria up by its bootstraps. In 2010, the now United States Secretary of State John Kerry called Assad's Syria a partner for peace, prosperity, and stability. And in 2011, the Israeli newspaper Haaretz called Syria an island of stability. Turning to Tunisia back in 2009, The Economist said that Ben Ali's regime was going nowhere. The Council on Foreign Relations Middle East expert said that there was near uniformity of opinion amongst his colleagues that Tunisia was the most stable of all the countries in the Middle East, while a single fruit vendor immolates himself and weeks later, that regime and several others in the region fell. Turning to Egypt, the State Department spokesperson P.J. Crowley called Egypt an anchor of stability. The former ambassador to Egypt, Francis Riccardioni, called Egypt a rock of stability in the region. And when Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was asked on January 25th, 2011, what is the United States government's assessment of the Egyptian government? She responded, quote, "Our assessment is that the Egyptian government is stable." The very next day, I was interviewed by a journalist and asked, what should President Obama do about Egypt? And I said, the first thing he should do is tell the Secretary of State not to talk about how stable Egypt is, because it's not, and it's going to fall. And 2 weeks later, the Egyptian government fell. I didn't have any of the access that Hillary Clinton or any of the other members of the national security had to secret documents, but I had spent some time in the Islamist slums of Cairo. And what I came away from that experience seeing was the utter dysfunction, the utter dilapidation, the general mess that Egypt was, and I thought to myself, Egypt is many things, but it is not stable. In a Cairo cafe speaking politics back in 2006, my friend silenced me immediately when I mentioned Mubarak, and he said in Arabic, "In hitan li hawidan," the walls have ears, don't speak politics here. And I think that the misassessments of so many people who should have known better emanated from a lack of understanding of the link between freedom and stability, between human rights and peace, going back to that great quote by Václav Havel, that there can be no external peace if there is no internal peace. That is to say, no peace between states so long as there is not peace between citizens of that state. One anecdote in particular sticks out in my mind. I worked for and was mentored by Natan Sharansky, who spent 9 years in Soviet prison. And when his wife Avital was traveling the world trying to free her husband, she visited the State Department, and a senior State Department official pointed to a map on the wall of the world, and he said to her, "Avital, you don't really expect us to relegate all of these important geostrategic challenges to the release of your husband." And she said, "What you don't understand is that those geostrategic challenges won't be solved until my husband is released." And I share that view of the world, that the more the West can do, the more the free world can do to open closed societies, to prioritize dissident struggles, the more likely we will be to see peace, prosperity, and stability. And so the title of this seminar is Problems and Proposals. So I have a few modest proposals that states can undertake and human rights organizations can undertake in order to further the cause. The first one being, don't praise tyrants anymore. When Prince Nayef was appointed Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia shortly before his death, the leader of the free world sent him a letter saying to our dear friend Crown Prince Nayef, who's been a steadfast ally of the West in the fight against terror, and accolades from throughout the world came pouring in, praising this draconian interior minister who for 35 years decimated opposition inside Saudi Arabia, who imprisoned liberals, who personally made the announcement saying that Saudi women would never be able to drive, who of liberal journalists said, "We will cut out their tongues." This was the great hope and partner of Western states who deserved no praise from Western leaders. When Bashar al-Assad was called a reformer going back now since the start of his term, 2001, 2002, many policymakers termed him a reformer. Why? Because he was educated a bit in London, because he was head of the telecom intercommunication project, because he had to be better than his father, and indeed, when the United States Secretary of State called him a reformer, shortly thereafter, I sat with Kamal Labwani, who spent 10 years in prison under Assad, and said, how exactly is he a reformer? Where exactly does his legitimacy come from? Because so many people would say, well, Assad has now lost legitimacy in 2012 due to his brutal crackdown, when in reality he had no legitimacy whatsoever to rule. And instead of focusing on the internal plight of Syrian dissidents, of Syrian human rights activists, leaders throughout the free world focused instead on negotiations, on geopolitics. And we could have done a lot more to support peace and prosperity and stability had we focused our time more on the internal dynamics of Syria. The second recommendation is to raise the names of dissidents and political prisoners. Now, Sharansky asked the question, why is it that he was freed in 1986 and his friend Anatoly Marchenko, another famous Soviet dissident, died in the same Chistopol prison that he was in, died after a similar hunger strike? And he said the difference was that the free world knew his name, and Soviet leaders knew that they would pay a price if something were to happen to him. With Marchenko, whose name was largely unknown, they knew that they would pay no price. One of our board members is Erwin Kotler, who was Justice Minister of Canada, and when Erwin Kotler asked Mikhail Gorbachev in 1997, why did you release Natan Sharansky? He said the following thing. He said, wherever I traveled in the world, no one would speak with me about what I was there to talk about. When I went to the Canadian Parliament in 1985 as Agriculture Minister, no one would talk with me about agriculture. But every time I left the Parliament, every time I walked outside of a building, I was confronted with placards and people shouting the name Sharansky. And he concluded with the following line. He said, it was not worth the international price we were paying. That admission from the leader of the Soviet Union is profoundly encouraging to those who believe that the more we raise the names, the more we force these autocratic regimes to answer for their crimes, that even they will respond to grassroots pressure, as happened in that case. Now, the former head of bilateral arms negotiations in the 1980s with the Soviet Union told me that every single meeting about arms control that he was in, they began by saying, we can't trust you on international arms agreement because you violate the Helsinki Final Act with your treatment of Yuri Orlov, Andrei Sakharov, and Natan Sharansky. I often wonder, and in meetings with policymakers, I'm generally disappointed that this doesn't happen today. It doesn't happen today when there are diplomatic accords with Iran. It doesn't happen at negotiating tables in Geneva. It doesn't happen with autocratic regimes which get tens of billions of dollars from Western countries. A friend of mine who was in the room as arms sales were being negotiated with the theocratic gender apartheid tyranny of Saudi Arabia said that human rights was not mentioned once in any of these meetings, let alone all of the political prisoners languishing in Saudi prison today. Small confirmation today that this approach not only worked with Sharansky 3 decades ago almost, but can continue to work today. 3 months ago, 2.5 months ago, I had a heated confrontation with Iran's foreign minister following a lunch where I said, do you think it's ironic, Foreign Minister Zarif, that you enjoy posting on Facebook when your government bans it in Iran? And he laughed and he said, ha ha, that's life. Verbatim, word for word. I then said, when will Majid Tabakoli be free, one of Iran's most famous political prisoners and the student leader who's been in prison for 4 years now? He said, I don't know him. And once he said that, I published it in the Daily Beast. It became a big story inside of Iran, and thousands of Iranians wrote to the foreign minister on Facebook saying, how dare you not know who our famous political prisoners are? Within days, that young student was released from prison for the first time in 4 years. It's not a happy story in the end because once the media pressure died down, he was quietly re-imprisoned. And so while the Iranians traveled the world on their charm offensive trying to convince the world during this lunch, the foreign minister sounded like a mix between Mahatma Gandhi and Mother Teresa, that there is no government on earth more dedicated to peace, human rights, equality, and justice as the Iranian government. And all one needs to do is look inside Evin prison, look inside torture chambers throughout Iran to see how liberals, dissidents, women's rights activists, atheists are treated inside that theocratic dictatorship. And so I have a modest proposal here in the Parliament of Copenhagen, and that is to join me in a new initiative called Dissidents Squared. I decided that one small thing we could do in order to raise the names of these dissidents is to rename the streets in front of every embassy of every dictatorship in the world after a political prisoner. So that every time these diplomats have to walk outside of their embassies or get their mail or write their address, they will have to use and see the names of their imprisoned dissidents. In 1984, the United States Congress changed the name directly in front of the Soviet embassy to Sakharov Plaza. Every time the Soviets walked outside, there he was. And 2 years later, he was brought in from exile, and it was a small tool in the wide effort to make sure that the world never forgot the plight of these individual Soviet dissidents. And so, let every Chinese embassy throughout the world be named Liu Xiaobo Plaza after the Nobel Prize winner imprisoned for 11 years. Let every Syrian embassy be called Mazen Darwish Plaza after the free speech activist. Let every Iranian embassy be renamed Majid Tebakoli Plaza so that no Iranian diplomat can ever again claim that he hasn't heard of the most famous political prisoners. That every time they step outside, not only the diplomats, but the free world is reminded of the true cost of these dictatorial regimes. Last week, the United States Congress adopted this idea in testimony before the Lantos Human Rights Commission. Sharansky brought it up, and Congressman Frank Wolf committed publicly to doing this, and so I would love it if members of Parliament here in Copenhagen would join us in this effort. The third recommendation is to link foreign aid to human rights, much like the Jackson-Vanik Amendment did in 1975. That was an incredibly bold and brilliant move by Senator Scoop Jackson, which tied most favored nation status of the Soviet Union to the right of Soviets to emigrate freely. There was a great debate at the time, and it continues in a slightly different form today. The Henry Kissingers of the world said, "This is a crazy idea. Why on earth would you risk nuclear exchange or war between the United States and the Soviet Union over what essentially amounts to a tangential issue, the right of Jews to emigrate freely?" But what Scoop Jackson understood was that the more pressure that the West could bring upon the Soviet Union, the more it could open up that society, the less likely war would be to come about. And there are innumerable opportunities to copy that effort today. Saudi Arabia was just awarded $60 billion worth of arms with no conditionality whatsoever, one of the largest arms deal in human history. Where might liberals in Egypt today be if they, and not their autocrat Hosni Mubarak, had been the recipient of $50 billion of aid over the last 30 years? Where might liberals in Saudi Arabia be today if they, and not their ruthless tyrants, had been the recipients of tens of billions of dollars of aid? Aid can also be tied to improvements in human rights, such as cutting down incitement. Saudi Arabia has one of the largest industries of incitement in the world. 6 million school children are taught with textbooks that Jews and Christians are ahfaz al-qarda wal-khanazir, the descendants of monkeys and pigs. This is not good for peace. It's not good for human rights. And the Western world can do a lot more to be serious about such an issue. And so I think it boils down to three basic principles that if parliaments around the world stood firm to, and human rights groups encouraged them to adhere to, peace and human rights would be strengthened. The first is the great principle of Andrei Sakharov, that in the end, the moral choice also turns out to be the most pragmatic choice. There are so many Faustian bargains around the world today where the West believes it's getting a small incremental benefit by backing this dictator against that dictator, this autocrat against that tyrant, and it invariably comes back to haunt us. The second principle is that we must trust states as much as they trust their own people. It's a simple principle, but a profound one. When we are collectively trying to decide how much we can trust Iran in their verification of dismantling nuclear arms, we must ask ourselves, how much does the Iranian government trust their own people? And so long as dissidents like Majid Tavakoli and bloggers like Shiva Ahari are sentenced to years and even decades sometimes in prison, we know just how much we can trust that regime. When diplomats are negotiating with Syria about a potential transitional government, we must ask the question, how much does that government trust its own people? When the Palestinian Authority is getting hundreds of millions of dollars of aid, yet imprisoning people for criticizing Mahmoud Abbas on Facebook, that government does not trust its own people. 5 years ago, the term of the president expired, and he continues to rule as a dictator, unwilling to hold free and fair elections. So the best thing we can do for peace in that case is to enhance human rights and strengthen civil society. And the last principle is that we must fear tyranny more than anarchy and prize liberty over stability. I think for far too long people have said the worst thing in the world is chaos. The worst thing is that we don't know who rules a country, and indeed it is a problem. But the prioritization of liberty and human rights above other factors, I believe, will be the greatest boon to peace, prosperity, and stability. And if we stay true to these three principles, and hopefully the three recommendations I outlined, it will not only be good for the peoples of closed societies around the world, but it will also make the rest of the world a much more stable and safe place. Thanks a lot for listening.
Okay, in keeping with the pattern that we've established, would anybody like to direct a question to Mr. Keyes? We would have a couple of minutes for that before we proceed to the panel discussion. Nobody has any questions? Yes, sir, would you please identify yourself?
My name is Flemming Rose. I'm the foreign editor of the Danish newspaper Jyllandsposten, and I'm a former correspondent in the Soviet Union, and I know Natan Sharansky quite well. The Helsinki process turned out to be very important for the dissolution of the Eastern Bloc, and Gorbachev and other Soviet leaders acknowledged that post factum. But in the Middle East, you don't have a Helsinki process. You don't have countries on both sides entering a mutual agreement about fundamental principles about government, human rights, civil rights, and so on and so forth. Do you think, I mean, is it possible to envision how you could establish some kind of international framework because in the Middle East or in that part of the world? Because, you know, the reason why the Soviet Union entered into the Helsinki Agreement was because they thought that they had the upper hand and they got something in return. Recognition of post-World War II borders. So was that a one-time solution, or do you think that the Helsinki process in a way could serve as an inspiration for the way we would deal with the Middle East? Thank you.
Sure. It's a really interesting question. There are a myriad of differences, of course, but there are some things which remain similar. I think that the tools that were used, such as linkage, such as raising distance names, can be multiplied in the case of, or can be copied in the case of the Middle East. But with that said, I think that the fundamental realization of the Helsinki process was that the whole thing needed to come down in order for there to be peace and human rights. The Soviet Union as an entity could not continue to exist. I remember something the great Middle East historian Bernard Lewis
said, he made a parallel. He said, just as the Soviet Union needed to collapse in order for there to be peace, so must the dictatorships of the Middle East. So to keep in power dictators like Assad, to keep in power dictators like Saddam Hussein or even Hosni Mubarak is a non-starter. So whatever the West can do to bring about the dissolution of these regimes and the strengthening of civil society and democracy must be done, but it starts with that recognition, which I think was a dramatic shift even in the West's approach to the Soviet Union from the mid-70s into the mid-80s. Richard Pipes' famous memo outline exactly this strategic aim, I think, needs to be or can be part of the way that today the West views the Middle East, and I think we're very, very, very far from that today. The broad consensus is, well, Mubarak was better than the Muslim Brotherhood, so he's slightly more secular, so let's back him. And while we don't want Al-Qaeda to take over Syria, so let's think about keeping Assad in power. And I think it was a very different strategic aim than the way that certain policymakers approached the Soviet Union. I don't know if that answers the question, but.